If you've looked at almost any industry recently, you might have noticed something subtle, which is that the companies inside it seem to be getting larger.
Not just growing in a normal, we are doing well kind of way. More like a quiet consolidation, where a handful of companies start to dominate most of the space, and everything else either disappears, gets acquired, or becomes a feature. And the strange part is, this is happening in industries that are supposedly competitive. There are still multiple companies, there are still choices, there are still brands that look different from each other. So technically, competition exists, it's just mostly internal. To understand why companies keep getting bigger, we need to understand what growth actually means in a modern economy. Because growth is not just about making more money, it's about maintaining position, and maintaining position has become more complicated. A long time ago, companies competed in relatively simple ways. You made a product, you sold it. If people liked it, you grew. If they didn't, you adjusted or disappeared. The market was fragmented, with many smaller players. Entry was difficult, but once you were in, the environment was relatively stable. A regional bank could compete with a national one. A local retailer could hold its own against a larger chain. Geography and logistics created natural limits on how big any single player could get. Now, the structure is different. Markets are more connected. Technology allows companies to scale faster, and information moves instantly. And most importantly, success compounds in ways that it didn't before. Which means the companies that succeed don't just grow, they accelerate. And once they start accelerating, they become very difficult to compete with. Let's start with something simple: scale. Scale is the ability to do more without increasing costs at the same rate. In traditional businesses, growth required proportional increases in resources. If you wanted to sell twice as much, you needed roughly twice the production, twice the distribution, and twice the effort. The relationship between growth and cost was fairly linear, which meant smaller companies could still survive. Their disadvantage was real, but not overwhelming. Now, in many industries, that relationship has changed. Digital platforms, global supply chains, and automation allow companies to scale without increasing costs at the same pace. A software company that serves 10,000 customers does not need 10 times more engineers than one that serves 1,000. The product is the same. The code is the same. The marginal cost of adding a new customer is close to zero. Which means larger companies become more efficient as they grow, and more efficient companies can offer lower prices, better services, or both, which attracts more customers, which increases scale further, which improves efficiency again. This is what people refer to as a feedback loop, a very effective one. Now, if you are a smaller company trying to compete with this, the situation becomes challenging. Because you are not just competing with a product, you are competing with a system that becomes stronger as it grows. Which means the gap between large companies and smaller ones tends to widen over time. Not because the smaller companies are doing anything wrong, but because the structure itself is tilted. The rules of the game reward size in ways that are built into how modern markets work. Now, let's add something else: network effects. Network effects occur when a product or service becomes more valuable as more people use it. Social platforms are the most obvious example. If everyone is using a particular platform, that platform becomes more useful simply because everyone is there, which makes it difficult for alternatives to compete even if they are technically better. Because the value is not just in the product, it is on the network, and networks are hard to replicate. Think about what it would take to build a competitor to a dominant messaging app. You could design something cleaner, faster, and more private, but if none of the people someone wants to talk to are using it, none of that matters. The product quality becomes almost irrelevant. What matters is presence, and presence takes time, critical mass, and a reason for people to switch all at once, which rarely happens. But network effects are not limited to social platforms. They appear in marketplaces, payment systems, logistics networks, and even certain types of software. The more users, the more data. The more data, the better the system. The better the system, the more users. Another loop. Now, combine scale with network effects and you get something powerful. Companies that grow large become not just bigger, but structurally advantaged, which means new competitors have to overcome multiple barriers at once, not just building a better product, but also matching scale, network, and efficiency, which is difficult. So, what happens instead is consolidation. Smaller companies get acquired, sometimes because they are struggling, sometimes because they are successful and represent a potential future competitor. Either way, they become part of a larger system, which allows the larger company to expand its capabilities while reducing competition. Now, let's talk about something that doesn't get discussed as much: data. Data has become one of the most valuable assets a company can hold. Not raw data necessarily, but the accumulated record of how people behave, what they buy, when they search, what they click, how long they stay, when they leave. Large companies collect enormous amounts of this over time, and that data makes their systems smarter. It helps them predict what customers want before they know they want it. It makes recommendations more accurate. It reduces waste. It improves targeting. Smaller companies don't have the same history. Even if they build a better algorithm, they're running it on less information, which means the product is often worse even when the technology is equal. Which is a strange kind of advantage. It has nothing to do with talent or innovation. It is purely the result of having been around longer and having collected more. Which means the first mover advantage in modern markets isn't just about brand recognition, it's about accumulation. And accumulation, like scale, compounds. Now, this is where things become slightly more interesting, because from the outside, it still looks like competition exists. There are still multiple brands, there are still different services, but many of them are owned by the same parent companies, which means the competition is, in some cases, happening within the same overall structure. Different teams, different products, different strategies, which can look like external competition but is actually part of a coordinated structure. The consumer sees options, the market looks diverse, but the economic activity, the revenue, the decision making, much of it flows back to the same places. Now, let's talk about something else: risk. In uncertain environments, size provides stability. Larger companies have more resources, more diversification, and more ability to absorb shocks. If one part of the business struggles, another part can compensate. This makes large companies more resilient, and resilience is valuable. Which means companies aim to grow not just for profit, but for protection, because being large reduces vulnerability. A downturn in one market can be offset by strength in another. An entire product line can be discontinued without threatening the overall structure. Smaller companies don't have that cushion. Every problem is more acute. Every setback carries more weight. Now add capital to this. Large companies have access to more funding. They can invest in new technologies, expand into new markets, and acquire competitors. They can operate at a loss in one area while making profits in another. They can experiment, fail, and try again without immediate consequences. Smaller companies do not have that same flexibility, which makes it harder for them to compete over time. And this dynamic applies to not just money, but to talent. Large companies can attract the best people. They offer stability, resources, prestige, and often the most interesting problems to work on, the kind of problems that only exist at scale. Which means the concentration of size becomes a concentration of capability. The best engineers, the best designers, the best operators, they tend to cluster in the same places, which makes the large companies even more effective, which makes them even harder to compete with. Now, combine all of this with regulation. Regulation is intended to maintain fair competition, but in practice, it can sometimes favor larger companies, because larger companies have the resources to navigate complex regulations, comply with requirements, and influence policy. They have legal teams, they have lobbyists, they have the ability to absorb compliance costs that might be devastating for a smaller player. Smaller companies may struggle with the same constraints, which creates an environment where growth and scale become even more important. And there is something slightly counterintuitive here. Regulation, when designed to control large companies, can sometimes entrench them, Because the compliance burden falls on everyone, but only the largest companies have the infrastructure to handle it without disruption. New entrants face those same requirements from day one, before they have the resources to manage them efficiently. Which is not to say regulation is bad, it is often necessary, but its effects are rarely neutral across company sizes. Now, none of this is happening because companies are trying to eliminate competition in a direct, obvious way. It is happening because the system rewards growth, and growth, when sustained over time, leads to concentration, which is a more polite way of saying fewer, larger players. Now, does this mean there is no competition? Not exactly. Competition still exists, but it changes form. Instead of many small companies competing in the same space, you have a few large companies competing across multiple spaces. And within those large companies, you have internal competition between teams, products, and strategies, which is why it feels like competition is still there even as markets become more concentrated. Because it is there. It's just structured differently.
The language of competition is still present. Companies still launch new products, undercut each other on price, and race to build new features. But the arena has changed. The stakes are different. And the number of players who can meaningfully participate has narrowed. Now here is the part that makes this slightly more complicated. Large companies can create benefits. They can offer lower prices, better infrastructure, and more consistent services. They can invest in innovation at a scale that smaller companies cannot. They can operate globally, connecting markets and resources in ways that were not possible before. They can absorb the cost of developing new technologies over long time horizons without needing immediate return. Fundamental research, long-term infrastructure, platforms that take years to become profitable. These are things that require the kind of patience and resources that only scale can provide. But they can also reduce diversity in the market. They can limit alternatives. They can influence pricing, availability, and access in ways that smaller companies cannot counterbalance. And perhaps less obviously, they can reduce the range of ideas that get tried. When a small number of large companies shape what products exist, what features matter, and what problems are worth solving, the diversity of approaches quietly narrows. Not through any deliberate censorship, simply through the logic of what is worth building at scale. Which creates a trade-off: efficiency and scale on one side, diversity and competition on the other, and the system tends to favor the first. Because it is easier to measure, easier to optimize, and easier to justify in terms of growth. You can put a number on efficiency, you can track it, report it, improve it. The cost of reduced diversity is harder to quantify. It shows up in the things that don't get built, the products that never launch, the ideas that never get funded. Those absences don't appear on any spreadsheet, which makes them easy to overlook. And easy to overlook tends to mean easy to ignore. There is also something worth noting about how this feels from the inside. For people who work at large companies, the experience is not of domination. It is one of pressure. Internal competition is real. Teams fight for resources. Products compete for attention. Strategies are debated and revised constantly. From inside the system, it doesn't feel like a monopoly. It feels like survival, which is part of why the pattern is so durable. The people driving consolidation are often not trying to reduce competition. They're trying to win. And winning under these conditions means getting bigger. The outcome is structural, not intentional, which makes it harder to address and harder to reverse. There is one more thing worth noting before we get there, which is that this pattern is self-reinforcing in a social sense, not just an economic one. The largest companies become reference points. They set the standard for what a successful company looks like. They attract attention, investment, and imitation. Founders build companies with the goal of becoming them, or being acquired by them. Investors fund startups with the same outcome in mind, which means the aspiration of the entire ecosystem is oriented toward consolidation. Not deliberately, not as a conspiracy, but as the natural direction of ambition when the rewards are structured the way they are. And the more that happens, the more normal it feels. A startup getting acquired by a large platform is not seen as a loss. It is often seen as a success, an exit, a validation, the goal achieved. which is worth pausing on because what feels like success tends to go unquestioned, and things that go unquestioned tend to continue. Now let's bring this back to the original idea. Why do companies keep getting bigger? Because the system rewards growth, because scale creates advantages, because network effects reinforce success, because data accumulates and compounds, because acquisitions reduce competition, because size provides stability, because talent concentrates where resources are, and because once a company becomes large enough, staying large becomes part of the strategy, not just expanding, but maintaining position, which often involves becoming even larger. So the next time it feels like industries are being dominated by fewer, larger companies, you're not imagining it. You're observing a natural outcome of how modern markets operate. A system where growth compounds, advantages reinforce themselves, and competition evolves into something that looks similar but functions differently. Where competition still exists, it's just mostly internal. Which is not necessarily a problem, but it is definitely a pattern, and patterns, once established, tend to continue. If this kind of breakdown is useful to you, consider subscribing. Every week, we explain the systems shaping money, work, and everyday life, clearly, without jargon, and without pretending any of it is simpler than it is. Click the subscribe button below. We look forward to seeing you in our next update. Also, this is a great moment to review any active subscriptions you may have overlooked.